All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for entering the room here. um, we're gonna get started in just a second, but again, thank you for joining. We're letting people get into the room, and you'll see on the screen here, we're here for our Shaping the Future webinar, our 2024 California Arts Advocacy Survey. Before we get started, just want to shout out the CA for the Arts team, along with other people that you will see speaking throughout today that have been incredibly helpful and impactful when it comes to this survey that our team was able to complete last year. Before we get started, though, I think it's important, and our team was meeting just before this and discussing this webinar, but also just discussing the state of the world and all of the things that we have been facing stepping into 2025. And so I want to ground us with some breaths and then also a quote, a Toni Morrison quote that I've seen so much at the beginning of this year, but I want to also give some background to it. So if we can just take a moment and collectively pause and breathe, I think that's a great way to start this session, and then we'll dive into this really important work. So feel free to breathe with me. We'll take 1 second just to breathe in and exhale. We'll do 3 breaths. Breathe in and exhale. Last breath. Just relax your body and breathe in and exhale. Good. This quote that I'm going to share is from the Nation article. If you're familiar with the publication The Nation, Toni Morrison quote that we've all probably heard a lot. I'm going to read the fullness of the quote so we have a background to it. She said, "I'm staring out of the window in an extremely dark mood, feeling helpless. Then a friend, a fellow artist, calls. He asks, 'How are you?' And if instead of 'Oh, fine, and you,' I blurt out the truth. 'Not well. Not only am I depressed, I can't seem to work, to write. It's as though I'm paralyzed, unable to write anything. I've never felt this way before.' I am about to explain with further detail when he interrupts, shouting, 'No, no, no, no. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. Not when everything is fine, but in times of dread. That's our job.' Toni Morrison said, 'I felt foolish the rest of the morning, especially when I recalled the artists who had done their work in gulags, prison cells, hospital beds, who do their work while hounded, exiled, reviled, pilloried, and those who were executed. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. This is how civilizations heal.'" And I want to read the last line of that article. She said, "I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art." All right, and that article should be dropped in the chat. I think I put it there for our team to share that in the chat for y'all to read a little bit more. And let's dive into this this webinar now. So you can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you for taking that moment to pause. All right, please introduce yourself in the chat. You can acknowledge the indigenous land that you're on. I currently live in Fresno, the Fresno area, and I'm on Yokuts land. And then please feel free to share a link for folks to connect with you so we can network and continue to learn about what the work that each of us are doing. And then an additional note that this event is being recorded, and the recording, the slides, and all resources will be shared with you all as registrants. You can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. All right, a few guidelines. This is set up like a webinar, and so if you have questions, please add it to the Q&A function so that it doesn't get lost in the chat. Also, we ask that you avoid buzzwords and explain references and acronyms so that we all have a clear understanding. And then please be respectful to your fellow advocates that are here today to honor perspectives in the chat. And you can go ahead to that next slide. I'm going to go through the next few slides pretty quickly for time purposes. But this is just so that if you're on while you're on Zoom and you would like to have closed captioning, you can hit the closed captioning little up arrow at the bottom of your screen, and you'll have closed captioning there. And you can go ahead to the next slide there, and another Zoom tool. You can click the view on the upper right corner to adjust your view, and you can have that side-by-side view, and it gives you the options there. And then you can click and drag the marker on the side to make the screen bigger of the speaker or the slide deck. You can go ahead to that next slide, please. All right, this is just a little bit of information about our organizations, our sister organizations. We have a 501c3, which is CA for the Arts, and then our C4 is our comprehensive lobbying organization, and that is CA Arts Advocates. So you may see both of them or the logos in some of our marketing material, or one or the other, but we are partnering organizations, sister organizations. So you can go ahead to that next slide. All right, and a little bit about our agenda for today. We're doing our welcome and introductions. We're going to do some reflections that our team will walk you through some of the findings. We have some of our readers that are our survey reviewers that are here today. We'll introduce them in a little bit, that will speak about their experience reviewing the survey. And then we have program and policy implications that we'll be going over as a team. That just gives you a little background, and then you can go to that next slide. And I think we're going to introduce, if I'm correct with the next slide, we'll do some introductions. Excellent. So we have our lead researchers. Thank you, Tracy, for leading this as our director of field engagement, and then Matt Carney. And you'll see our readers were Ted Russell, Jean Johnstone, David Holland. We'll give more introductions as we go, and then our policy and program implications will be led by myself, along with our CEO, Julie Baker. And I think on the next slide, I'll be hopping off and passing it over to Tracy and Matt. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. If we could share, we're going to share some broad reflections, key insights, patterns, etc., on what we found in the survey, and tee us up for a deeper conversation about some of the implications for the field, for advocacy, arts advocacy, and for field building programming. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share the foundational goals underlying the survey. Just a second, that shaped really the design, the execution of the survey, as well as our analysis of the data. And you'll notice these goals are pretty exploratory in nature, surfacing issues and challenges and solutions and wanting to understand conditions. We're working with a foundational assumption that members of the field are in various stages of emergence from the acute impacts of COVID, but we didn't necessarily possess the knowledge of all the dimensions of those states of emergence. So we really leaned into qualitative data. We really wanted to hear from folks in their own words how they're defining and experiencing current conditions. And the report itself, you'll find, is pretty conversational, pretty sweeping. And what we really wanted to do within the report was to uplift multifaceted points of view around particular themes and topics. And this really helps us as an advocacy organization, the California Arts Advocates, with its ear on the ground in Sacramento, hearing from different voices of the field and being able to make linkage to shifting priorities at the state level, where our issues intersect with other sectors, etc. It also helps us to hear from multiple points of view for developing our programs and to really serve a diverse state, both geographically, racially, ethnically, etc. So the multiplicity of voices also reflect a second assumption that we are working with, that we have the capacity to reach really a subset of the arts and culture field in terms of being, a network of folks who identify as advocates. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't prioritize certain voices in a quantitative way, but really reflect the multiplicity of folks' experience. And we hope this will be informing our work, and we hope it's valuable to you in terms of identifying areas of focus for advocacy investment in your work. Next slide. And Matt will tell us a little bit more about the methodology.
Thank you, Tracy. Really great to be here today. I'm coming from the land of the Kumai here in the Southern California region. I think I sent that to the panelists, not everyone. So I'm here wearing multiple hats as an artist, advocate, and administrator, but here today as a data scientist where a lot of my education lies. So we wanted to explain a bit about our approach and briefly review our methods, design, and analysis strategies for this survey. In terms of methods, you'll see that we had mostly a qualitative approach. And what does this mean exactly? We, unlike quantitative approaches where you come in with a hypothesis, we wanted to make sure instead that what we were researching and what we were discovering was coming directly from the data. Thus, the design was composed of 85% of open-ended and short answer questions. And then we offered two tracks, one for organizations and one for individuals. To analyze the data, we used a clustering method to pull out the main themes and patterns. This means that we coded every little individual response within topics to discover the main themes that floated to the top that you'll see today. In addition, we consulted with the other readers that we'll hear from today to get another perspective of the data and to get further feedback. And we also use secondary data that from other sources that you'll see sprinkled throughout the report. Next slide. This, you can see the broad view of who we reached and how the survey was deployed. We distributed the link to the survey via the Californians for the Arts outlets like the website, social media, and e-newsletter, and also partnered with other organizations and individuals that were able to deploy the message through their networks as well. This targeted outreach approach helped us reach more individual artists, a wide geographical range with all 58 California counties represented, and a concerted effort to reach rural regions, considering that 94% of Californians live in urban areas and less than 6% live in rural areas. So 94% of Californians live in urban areas and less than 6% live in rural areas. So you can see how that is different from what we had here. Next slide.
In terms of the organizations that we reached, you'll see we had a real high representation of arts and culture-based nonprofits. There's also some overlap in the nonprofit data because we wanted to folks to be able to flag if they also were providing services. We wanted to make that more visible to us in the field. But there's a high representation of organizations, of nonprofit organizations that responded. And we're pleased that we did have substantial responses from organizations of different sizes in the state. Next slide. And then in terms of individuals, we did allow, ask folks to select what their three top roles that they perceive they play in the arts ecosystem, and almost 70% identify as artist, artisan, and creative worker, and 30% identified as a teaching artist. And this allowing folks to select multiple roles was to acknowledge how many of us actually piece together a creative practice with employment and self-employment, et cetera. We just wanted to get a sense of that in the data, and to also just remember that there isn't a big divide between artists and organizations and businesses, that we often weave all the way through. Artists and artisans weave through the ecosystem, the structural, the business and entity structures. Next slide. And the demographic information was really important for us to collect, to both test who are we reaching and test who can we authentically say we're representing. And so to compare our results in terms of survey responses, we first compared with a 2021 report, Arts Workers in California by the Center for Cultural Innovation, and their demographic data that they were able to provide. And you can see that our survey responses align with general demographic data, and we have there's places where we can improve in terms of connection and engagement. And then we also noticed that our age skewed really high, female participation skewed high, and also educational level, which is not on this slide, but it's in the report. And we're really curious about that. And so we compared that with a 2017 report, a baseline demographic survey by Americans for the Arts. And our data with Americans for the Arts was really, really similar in terms of 75% women responded to their surveys. And so without really going into deep analysis, what we're assuming from that is that our network of advocates, of networks, would pattern similar to the national network of advocates with Americans for the Arts. So we just want to keep that in mind. And this also reflects some of the other deeper data analysis about the demographic makeup in arts and culture and the factors driving that. This survey doesn't touch on that, but we point to some of those studies in the report.
Yeah, and thank you, Tracy. And then we also wanted to note and acknowledge and hold space for the 42% of survey respondents that did not answer the demographic questions. This isn't unheard of in terms of people not wanting to be labeled or not understanding how the data would be used and shared. And also in terms of survey design, for this survey, the demographic questions were at the end of the survey, which arguably led to some drop off. Some theorists say that it's better to put the demographic questions at the beginning of the survey, and other theorists say it's better to dive directly into the survey material, which is what we did. So we'll definitely consider that design in future research.
Thank you. Next slide. Mm-hmm. So in terms of just key findings, there were some real high level messages that we got from the insights shared in responses woven throughout all the questions. One that really stood out is that many California arts workers and organizations that participated in our survey are facing precarity. And as an advocacy organization, this allows us to tell the story to decision makers about how this state puts our California's creative economy at risk, and its identity as a global center of cultural production. Secondly, with almost all folks responding in terms of 85% of organizations, and then 67% of individuals, a high number, responding that over the past 3 years, COVID and other factors really remade their approach to certain parts of their work, and that creativity, innovation, and resourcefulness really came out in the descriptions of those changes and adaptations. And also woven throughout all the responses is that social justice and equity movements continue to reshape the values and practices of the field. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that we have to acknowledge that in this window since our last survey in 2020, another really powerful, important factor was the murder of George Floyd and too many others, and the movements that came from that and helped us reimagine and reinvent how are we serving and who. Next slide.
For this one, we gave 11 options for survey participants to choose from. And what you can see here, what we learned is that there is a lot of alignment between individuals and organizations. That here, where we're both uplifting issues of public funding and patron support, and also that connection between organizational operating expenses and access to housing and workspaces for individuals. Next slide.
Well, there were some areas, there are numerous ways that our field pivoted and adapted over the past 4 years. And folks reflected on new partnerships, new business models, even new roles for the arts in their local communities, new ways of working together, new methods of sharing resources, all of which are enduring. And also technology played a big role, access to, cheap technology like Zoom and other virtual tools really transform the way that people conduct work or connect with their audiences or networks. That was important. And we'll talk a little bit more about how important collaboration and collective action is becoming to the field as well. Next slide.
For this, we asked these questions so that we could be and see specifically where people were having the most difficulty. And this is another area that organizations and individuals were having similar issues. Broadly, the pressure that was felt was the mix of increased and rising costs paired with, unfortunately, funding scarcity. We saw this further amplified within rural communities. People were not just seeing higher expenses and lower amounts of funding as a logistical issue, but as something that was inhibiting their ability to create art and express their identity. So though we saw some pragmatic economic pressure points, it appeared that the field saw California at a precarious place of having its cultural identity at risk, and that there is a really need for true systems change. Next slide.
And one of the prevalent systems change that the field is engaging in is a commitment to advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. We saw a real commitment and passion in the results. Some are deepening long-held practices or expanding practices to focus externally on how they can more holistically serve communities. Others are reimagining leadership structures and power sharing models, serving as laboratories for the field. That was great to get those insights from folks. There are also challenges. Survey participants that identified as being racialized or minoritized feel that they're bearing the burden of advancing this work, and they're really seeking allyship and shifts in access to resources and power. Folks that are adopting practices are really struggling to define and measure outcomes. And several people doing equity-focused cultural work in conservative areas taught us, shared that they're actually being targeted for that work, for being explicit about that work, and having their funding and et cetera put at risk. And of course, now we have new challenges in understanding federal priorities related to this. And the fissures that we noted on the pressure, and one of the pressure points that's kind of really interesting to note is there is perceptions in the field that that my group does not have access to funding that the other groups have, and those perceptions are kind of shared amongst different groups. And those perceptions are, of course, lived experience and backed up by data, whether it's regional or racial, ethnic sense of divisions, or even cultural form or art forms feeling that they're not getting funding like other art forms. That's all studied in other reports and such. But what's interesting for us as advocacy organizations is these fissures are fault lines in terms of unifying the field. How do we bring each other together to develop a collective voice and take collective action? How do we grow each of us having a stake in each other's success, and funding scarcity? That scarcity sense really, we think, probably also shapes these perceptions. Next slide.
So rather than assuming what we might think would be helpful for the field, we captured information on what specific services participants needed. Shown here are the top items there. I want to note, just from a design perspective, that participants were offered the option to choose more than one answer, thus the percentages being over 100 here in total, if you're doing math over there. Much of what rose to the top here spoke to the need of shared resources and collaborations. I think that sometimes it's assumed that collaborations just happen, but an important data point that came through was the need to fund collaborations, both in sector and cross sector. For example, with art and public health, tourism, climate activism, and community revitalization. And particularly with the work of Californians for the Arts, we still see the field requesting more professional development and training in advocacy and coordination to be able to advance things on the local level. Next slide.
And then we also offered, we had ranked choice questions on 9 policy areas that California for the Arts or California Arts Advocates work on or are tracking. And we asked folks to do a ranked choice, like pick their top 3 policy priorities that they think would have the biggest impact either on their work or on their community. And what was interesting here is just the alignment between organizations and individuals. Even arts workers and organizations represented the individual perspective by having, identifying social safety net programs as their 4th highest priority, and folks wanting resources and help, wanting to get behind our work and trying to diversify sources of funding for the field through cross-sector initiatives, etc. And I think, yeah, just that alignment really stuck out for us in this finding. Next slide. And then overall, they're looking beyond funding. There were 2 real kind of structural themes, structural needs that were identified, or in the patterns and themes in the survey. One is support for collaboration, and we'll unpack that a little bit more. And the other is infrastructure, support and services that everyone in the field could use in different areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about both of those. Next slide, please.
So to maximize collective impact while both individuals and organizations are having limited resources and capacity, collaboration becomes the pathway to get us through. And this list helps us as advocates know how we can start tailoring our policy and legislative agendas to the needs of the fields. As mentioned before, you'll see that these are things that need to be funded and supported to really see them into fruition. You probably noticed that these items are directly related to what the field said they needed, where the needs become the solution. It's time to focus on coalition building and collective advocacy to help garner support to foster cross-sector solutions and shared business models and strategies. Next slide.
Thanks. And I just want to talk a little bit more about creative economy infrastructure. We really want to think about that as the material, physical, material, and social systems that arts workers and cultural organizations need in order to sustain or grow their practices. So we're talking about, space, housing and space in terms of physical, and also then regulations in terms of zoning and permitting that impact the physical world, access to capital in terms of material or financial systems. And that came up a lot, not just scarcity of funding, but the funding that's there, folks feeling, that they're ineligible for the grants that are there, or too small to compete, or the grant processes are too complex. What folks shared in terms of the relief funding they received during COVID, or the small business loans, or operational funding, that the having that discretion over your funding, having it not just be directed towards programs, but towards making choices, allowed them to make strategic investments that were really critical to both their sustaining through COVID and reinventing themselves in this emerging future. And we know and also arts workers and cultural organizations are calling for entities to help them that can serve as centralized hubs for information sharing, resource development, training, marketing, and advocacy coordination. That arts service organizations can play a critical role in creative economy infrastructure. Next slide. I'm going to hand it back to Nefesha so we get to hear from some of the readers that contributed to the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Matt, for your leadership with this. We're going to dive into the next portion of this webinar and discuss with our readers their experience being able to review the survey before the rest of the world had the opportunity to. So Jean Johnstone is one of our reviewers, leader of J. Johnstone Consulting. Ted Russell, who is a consultant with our organization, CA for the Arts, along with doing a lot of other consultant work, special consultant work. And then David Holland, whom I'm not sure if he is present, but if not, no worries. I know scheduling is always a challenge with many of us. So Elsie, thank you for doing the slide. You can go ahead and take that slide off, and then we've got our readers. And Jean, I'm going to start with you. And if we can take about 2 to 3 minutes to share about your experience, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, great to be here. Gosh, well, a few things really stood out for me in looking over the report in some of its earlier versions. And it really, these guys have hit on it already, but these concepts of the lack of support, which we hear all the time in the arts, right, about scarcity and so on. But the way it showed up in the need for collaboration and in infrastructure were really, really interesting to me in particular, because everybody in the field was doing this as a response to COVID, right? Using our creativity and being on our toes to shift because we had to. But those skills give us so many opportunities moving into another really fraught environment here. We have a lot of opportunities. So,
Ted, I want to offer your space for you to maybe comment if you have any thoughts on Jean's reflection.
Yeah, no, that's so much of what struck me was that timeliness of the collaboration, how we're leading into it. I love the creativity of our field, and we make $1 out of 15 cents sometimes, and leaning on each other has just been so important. And we saw a lot of that in the pandemic, even with people creating their own mutual aid systems. So for me, it's just funny to reflect on, decades ago, there was a real moment, in philanthropy. I worked as a grant maker for 2 decades, so I can comment about this kind of from the inside. It's interesting how these trends and shifts in philanthropy where they tend to move together like schools of fish. But I feel like there was a moment when philanthropy was focusing on collaboration, but it was sometimes happening in ways where they are almost forcing groups to collaborate or they weren't as responsive to the needs. So what I suggest, seeing how many funders are in the room who showed up in the chat, is finding ways to support those collaborations, really that the field is seeking to actually follow their lead, and I think that can be done well. Worked most recently at the Kenneth Rainin Foundation. That was a lot of what we supported in terms of shared business models, groups working together, and even looking at artist cooperatives, community land trust, those sort of things. So I think there are a lot of solutions that can happen where we can support collaborations and the service organizations that provide the tools to do that, since groups that are seeking to do it don't have to recreate the wheel from scratch, are really important. So for the service organizations to share those models, success stories, cautionary tales, I think it's really important. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Gene, and glad I could just add a little additional shape to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. What was also really interesting to me was that some of the overlaps that we saw between the individual artist responses and the organizational responses. They are strikingly similar, right? They're phrased differently because artists are looking for housing and affordable workspace, and are going to, phrase the needs that way. But organizations are also looking for the kind of infrastructure support to keep their businesses going. And those overlaps are just so compelling and really point to that need for that collaboration and that acknowledgement from funders, from our cities, our communities, from at the state level, et cetera, how vital that collaboration really is, and how we all have a role within this ecosystem, right? If we only fund the individual artists or only the organizations, or focus only on audience needs, that's going to be not sufficient. But if we look at them all as part of this ecosystem and can support ways for us to collaborate, then maybe we can get a little further, especially in times where the funding is tight, and we already know that it constantly is. But as we head into a period of potentially more instability financially, looking for other mechanisms, partnerships, and kind of ways to work together to maximize our resources that aren't necessarily just dollars. We're going to need to do it, right? It's going to behoove us.
So we have a few more minutes. Ted, do you have any additional thoughts around your experience, as a reviewer?
Yeah, no, I just really want to thank not just California for the Arts for conducting the survey, since there obviously was a need and a lot to be expressed by the field. And I love the way the organization operates. I'm seeing more of that as a consultant with one of the projects. But I just also want to especially thank Tracy Hudak as the director of field engagement and the lead researcher, and Matt Carney, just with all the effort and knowledge you put into that. So it's very interesting in this process, working through the different drafts and really trying to elevate things in a way that the document is readable. For all of you who haven't read it yet, please click on the link and check it out. And I think because it's, as Matt pointed out, kind of the difference between qualitative and quantitative surveys. And while the huge number of responses, 1,680, isn't a randomized sample, so it's not a scientific survey in that way, but it's a large sample size. So I think it's really important. And part of why I got so excited was such a huge percentage, over 80%, said that they're likely to advocate for increased funding for the California Arts Council. And I think that's a crucial finding that we need to act on. And we actually need to expand it 100-fold beyond those almost 1,700 respondents. And we also need to expand that beyond just increased funding for California Arts Council. It needs to be for so many places that impact arts, that impact organizations as small businesses operating in their communities. So I think that element that points towards advocacy is hugely important. Um, And I'd also say the other founding that stands out to me really is the financial challenge that we all feel. And yet to see it reflected in this survey so broadly across the state was huge. I mean, we're really hit by rising cost, and Matt described that really well. But, this goes beyond inflation. It's something that was reflected in research that the Kenneth Rayner Foundation supported about organizations in the Bay Area. We've seen it in data coming in from across the state and nationally. And, it's just crucial that we haven't seen the revenues increase proportionally, and definitely not wages for artists, other cultural workers, creative workers. So when we describe this and respondents describe this underinvestment in the arts as a mistake, we also, in our advocacy work, have to go to the next point of the case making. We have to describe this underinvestment in terms of what are the problems about that? What is the state missing out on? What are other Californians missing out on by not investing in the arts? So we know that we aren't funded the way we were. We know the kind of challenges and cuts and stress that we have trying to keep getting arts out there, whether we're making it individually or whether we're putting it out there as an organization. But let's talk about how these impact our communities and what additional investment would mean in terms of more artists, more diverse artists being able to create their work, in terms of health in our communities and community vibrancy, which has been studied and analyzed, safety in our communities, a sense of belonging. There's so many things that arts impact. So we have to take what we know as this underinvestment, and we need to translate it for every type of Californian in rural communities, suburban communities, urban communities, to understand what they would get out of the additional investment in artists in our nonprofit arts organizations.
Hi, David. Good to see you. I'll just
There's my
tag on.
guy. Hey.
Hi, David. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Ted and Jean, for giving your insights. David, we'd love to hear from you about what your experience was like and what you learned from the survey as a reviewer.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. Just jumping in from another meeting. I thought about a few areas that were particularly resonant with me, and it was interesting and exciting in some ways to read about the results of the survey. One of them is the significant appetite for advocacy expressed by stakeholders across the state, and the opportunity that that provides for California for the Arts as an organization, of course, but also what it means for the sector as a whole, particularly in the moment that we're in, with all the changes happening at the federal level, of course, but also all the changes that are dynamic within the state environment and within local communities. The fact that people are willing to step up and take part and express their perspective and their point of view and become involved in the political process in ways that advance the field, I thought was an enormous opportunity across the board. Another area that I thought was interesting and I was very interested and delighted to see was around what I say is innovation. So both this technology adoption and adaptation that was prompted by the pandemic, but which has continued, I think is important. Also in a state like California, in which the technology sector is so important, I think that there could be some interesting opportunities ahead to explore that further, and how the relationships between industries and the state can be facilitated to support that kind of process of technology adoption, adaptation, and what the relationship between arts and technology is, which I know a lot of folks across the field nationally and even internationally are interested in, and think that there are a number of opportunities for the arts and culture sector to be engaging with technologies in ways that support its advancement, and not just seeing technology as something that's a threat to the viability of the sector as a whole. So I thought that that was a promising thing that I saw in the results. Also, the folks really leaning into collaboration, which has not always been the mode in the sector because of the way it's set up. You know, a lot of things are based on opportunities and awards for individual artists, not always necessarily working in concert as part of a community of artists. Similarly with the nonprofit arts sector, there has traditionally been some degree of competition based on resource constraints and things like that. But seeing artists and organizations really move into collaboration as an opportunity to advance the work overall is, I think, something that can continue to evolve and is a great sign about the evolution of our field as a whole. And then the last thing that I'll end with is that from the individual artist side and the organizational side, there were two areas that I saw where there are jointly identified opportunities and challenges together. One of those is around public funding, and both artists and organizations recognizing that limitations and constraints around public funding affect both individual artists and organizations. And obviously, that's central in part to the work of California for the Arts in terms of advocating for robust public investment that is supporting both individual artists and arts and cultural organizations and other stakeholders in the field. So the fact that the stakeholders that filled out the survey identified that as really like among their very top priorities aligns very neatly with the work of the organization and its work with the broader field and communities across the state. And the other one I thought that could be an interesting opportunity is the challenge around engagement of patrons, because that's sort of the other part of the sector that sometimes isn't talked about as much, but does fuel a lot of the activity. How are patrons, however we define that, but individuals, families, and communities engaging with individual artists and supporting their work and with our arts and cultural organizations. So I think that is an interesting angle to think about for the future, is about engaging that constituency, both in terms of participating in arts and cultural experiences and leaning into that maybe in a more robust way. There was a dampening of a lot of that during the pandemic. Some of that has held. How can we get people back out experiencing things, excited about things, engaging in the same way? And there's a lot of things, other things I could talk about in that, but also how can we leverage that group as advocates as well because of the important role that they play, like as a broader public, which I think is important in communicating to elected officials about the importance of this work. And so I definitely see that as being a potentially interesting angle to think about more and pursue for California for the Arts and for all of us engaged in arts advocacy and cultural policy across the field.
Thank you, David. Thank you to each of our reviewers for the survey. Really appreciate your insights and really thoughtful responses there. With our limited time, we're going to transition to our next portion of this webinar. But I just want to thank you, David, Jean, and Ted for taking the time today and also the time in the past to review the survey. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Likewise. All right, LT, can you go ahead and put our slide deck back up? I'm going to briefly go through our program implications, and then Julie will go into some of the policy implications. If you have on your schedule for 1 p.m., we may go over for just a few minutes, but we'll try to wrap as quickly as possible. All right, you can go ahead to that next slide there, please. All right, here you're going to see obstacles to movement building. A lot of the things that were just touched on by David, Jean, and Ted, we're going to kind of talk about and how we can implement some of these things. But let's first start with the obstacles to movement building. 3 were identified in the survey, including competition for limited resources. We know that many artists and arts organizations are vying for the same pool of resources, including funding and time and support. But we've seen a lot of responses around collaboration, and today's conversation has been a lot around community, and so we're seeing that shift. Another obstacle is the lack of time and strained lives, and so again, many arts workers are facing overwhelming personal and professional commitments that limit their capacity to engage in movement building efforts. And so thinking about how we're sharing time, how we're pulling down or limiting those barriers is very important. And then another obstacle is a lack of funding for advocacy, which many of us know. Advocacy takes time, it takes effort, and it takes funding. And so without that sufficient funding, it could be well-intentioned initiatives that can fall short. So it's essential to develop creative funding strategies. And so that's something that we as an organization have been talking about, and also partnering with other organizations in our conversations. You can go ahead to that next slide there. We're going to talk about some of the key findings from our field survey. Some of our key findings is that respondents expressed an urgency to create change. We see that consistently, even in this presentation today, there's a widespread desire to see tangible improvements in the arts sector. And again, we see insufficient funding as a top challenge. Lack of funding hinders the ability to implement these programs and advocate effectively. And then advocacy engagement insights, we see while less than 20% of the respondents self-identify as advocates, a significant 82%, I think Ted mentioned this, are likely to advocate for increased funding for the CAC, for the California Arts Council. And a more specific 55% say they are more likely to advocate for the cause, which shows strong interest in supporting the arts through advocacy. And then one last point in this slide deck is, or in this slide, is that top motivations for advocacy, which you'll see in the purple box there, is the number one motivation for advocacy participation is that policy changes directly affect the work and livelihood of arts workers. And then the second biggest motivation is being asked by a trusted colleague. We all know that when we get asked to advocate or to do something by someone that we trust, we're more apt to respond and be proactive about that. You can go ahead to that next slide there. We're going to talk about recommendations for the field building. So the reviewers, our team, our field engagement team was able to put together some recommendations based on this survey. These 5 recommendations are things that we've been thinking about that lead into some of our programming here at CA for the Arts. And so trust is a central ingredient. Accessibility is the key to capacity. Build a network of networks, building a knowledge base for local advocacy, and activate partnerships to accelerate change. When you read the survey report, you'll see this and an expanded bullet points for each of these. And I'd encourage you to take a moment to do that. You can go ahead to the next slide there. We're going to talk a little bit about CA for the Arts programs and how we're being responsive to the survey and learning more. We continue to respond to this survey data and the needs of the field, and our efforts are focused on establishing networks and partnerships that can support funding for artists and art organizations while strengthening our sector. We heard a lot about systems change, and I think that's important that we begin to continue to think about that when we're implementing programs like our Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month and our Summit and Advocacy Day, programs that all take place in April. And these events highlight the vital role of the arts in society and emphasize the value of for arts advocacy. And one thing that I want to call out is that we did a call for proposal this year for our 2025 summit, and that really diversified our summit planning this year. And you can go ahead to the next slide. Just going to briefly talk about some of our other programs. One in particular, we can go to the next slide there. Sorry, I'm talking a little fast. There we go. One in particular, a grassroots artist advocacy program, which is under a regional advocacy infrastructure network, is kind of an umbrella program. And Ted has been leading that program. We were able to develop a fellowship program for artist advocates in the Bay Area with a long-term mission to expand our program statewide. This is a part of our commitment to building relationships and partnerships that can support artists at all levels. And then we have our regional conversations, and this summer we'll be hosting a series of regional conversations throughout the state that allows us to listen and learn a little bit more about the needs and the aspirations of the art sector. And then lastly, we have the Performing Arts Equitable Payroll Fund. And if you're not familiar with that, please go to our website and check that out. We have a series of webinars coming up so you can learn more about the fund, how it reimburses a portion of payroll costs on a quarterly basis, using a tiered reimbursement schedule that ensures that small organizations receive the highest percentage of reimbursement. So thinking about equitable work in all of our programs and making sure that we're responding to the survey. If you have any questions or you would like to learn more about any of our programs or thinking through how we can work and partner with you, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself, and I'll put my email in the chat. And now I'm going to pass it over to Julie to talk a little bit about the policy recommendations from the survey. And you can go to the next slide there. Thank you.
Terrific. Oh my goodness. What a massive amount of incredible humans doing amazing work. All of you in the chat as well, and the team from CA for the Arts, as well as all the readers and all the people contributed, and to the 1,600 plus people who responded to the survey. We really, really thank you. It makes a huge difference. So I'm Julie Baker. I'm the CEO of both our organizations. I'm proud to be able to, honored to be able to work with this incredible group of humans. So go to the next slide. You know, the survey is really important to us in terms of sometimes either validating the work that we're doing or opening our eyes to things that we hadn't yet thought of. And that's what's really important in terms of analyzing this data. I'm going to not run through these slides. So those are the 7 recommendations that are specifically in the report. And I really encourage you to read the report. A lot of work was put into it. And again, I see some funders here, which is awesome. And I think it's really great that, and I hope you get a chance to read the report. Next slide. I'm going to go through each of these. I just want to also state that everything that we think about is grounded in racial and cultural equity. We just finished our Vision 2030 in terms of a strategic plan. And it's really around equitable redistribution of power and resources. And that's something that every aspect of our recommendations that we think about in terms of policy and programmatic priorities focuses in on. So just wanted to highlight that in our work. Next slide. So the first one is, yes, continued increased funding to our state arts agency, which is the California Arts Council. While California is one of the leading states for the creative economy, we actually are not matching that investment in terms of the arts agency that holds grants for arts and culture organizations, as well as artist fellowship grants, direct art grants to artists. As you can see, you know, actually we've seen some increase. There was years when it was only $1 million, so we're certainly better. But right now where we are is about $21 million for the entire state of California for arts and culture grants across the state. We lost about $5 million last year in the budget cuts. So, you know, advocating for the increased funding to the CAC, you can see if you follow what's going on there, we are fighting over scraps, and the council has to make very difficult decisions about how to ensure that there is equitable access to this funding. But the reality is, and Ted said this earlier, when we don't have enough funding, we will never get to the place where everyone who needs this and who can operate in a way that can provide the services to their communities that you all do, these really essential services that artists and cultural bearers and arts nonprofits are doing in our communities, we cannot do that without the investment. And one area historically is through a state arts agency. So that is going to continue to be a prioritization. However, diversifying, increasing funding for arts jobs across a lot of different areas is also an emphasis that we've seen across the nation, because one of the things that we recognize is that arts is often siloed. And so when we're looking at a state arts agency's budget, it may often be much, much smaller than many other budgets: public health, mental health, transportation, workforce development, all small business, all these areas, economic development. So how can we ensure that we are a part of those solutions? And we have amazing programs that were funded by the state, $60 million in one-time funds for something like the Creative Corps, cultural districts, creative youth development, arts in the parks, all of those things. Clean California, that provides jobs in terms of beautifying our communities. How do we translate this into employment opportunities for artists and culture bearers? And that's something that we continue to prioritize in our policy priorities. Next slide. This is a big conversation in the Q&A, and I can assure you this is, as you can see, one of the top priorities that came out of the survey. It is one of the top priorities we're working on with our GAP, our Grassroots Artist Advocacy Fellows. It is a top priority in terms of the task forces. We actually have a task force around affordable housing for artists and culture bearers. If you're interested in learning more about that, please put your information in the chat. We are looking at and working with the state that is doing a lot around housing. How do we ensure that artists have access to affordable housing and space in our communities, as we know that it is critical and essential for local community development, for artists to be able to live and thrive in the communities that they are providing all of these amazing services to. Social safety net programs, we're looking at how 1099. As we all know, artists and culture bearers are the largest group. Arts workers are the largest 1099 workforce, and yet employment and social safety net benefits are not designed for 1099 self-employed independent contractors. What do we need to do to ensure that there are services, portable benefits, guaranteed basic income, unemployment insurance, childcare, healthcare, and how can we work with the folks that are already leading these issues instead of trying to do it on our own and in silos? So building that coalition is a huge piece of what we do here, and trying to understand who else is in the work and supporting and recognizing how important it is that arts are at the table for these conversations. Art workers are seen as a labor force that needs to be considered in terms of all of these issues. We also know that creative entrepreneurship, tech assistance, and training. So there are actually a tremendous amount of services and financing and things out there through your Small Business Administration, through your Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, through your local models. And we want to make sure that that is actually known to our sector. A lot of times we tend to just look for the word arts on the door. And as David Holland said to us in a meeting, often the arts are not the word on the door, but the arts can be serviced here. So how do we ensure that our sector understands all of the opportunities, and how can we assist in the training available for this type of financing? Next slide. I'm going fast because we're at the end here. Happy to share any more of this with other folks. And again, this goes into this increasing access to capital. While grants are one option, and it's lovely to get a grant that you don't have to finance yourself, we need to be also thinking about how can we invest, how can we look at arts and the creative process as research and development, as critical and essential to our communities, as essential as technology and manufacturing. Creativity is a core and essential skill that we need. And how can we look at that from an investment, whether that's impact investing, whether it's building through a solidarity economy? How do we support cooperative business models? And of course, as somebody else put in the Q&A, building ownership. And there's a lot of movement towards that. There are a lot of people doing great work. We are not here to do that work. We are here to amplify it and to look at the public policy solutions and the barriers that are preventing this happening for our sector. And then things like regulatory conditions, and how do we educate policymakers? So we work a lot on making sure that there are hearings at the state level about the issues impacting the field, as well as, again, the way that we are solution providers to many of the civic issues that our state is facing. And we also are going to be working on specific legislation this year. So as we continue to develop our legislative priorities for this year, we hope you'll engage with us further during Arts Advocacy Day on April 23rd, during Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month. We'll give you tons of tools to lift up these issues and to talk about the role of artists and cultural bearers, arts nonprofits, the entire creative ecosystem in, I did it before, health, healing, and hope, which I think we can all agree we certainly need so much more of that today. So I'm going to wrap there because I tried to do it really fast. And we'll bring it back to, I think, Nefesha.
Thank you, Julie. That was super fast, but thank you so much. And if like Julie said, if you have more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and be sure to read the survey. You can go ahead to the next slide because we're going to basically just talk about ACCM, Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month, and then I'm going to pass it to Tracy to finish us off. We have some webinars coming up February 20th. When this slide deck goes out, you'll be able to click that, but we can also put the link in the chat for the Lawmakers Toolkit webinar coming up. And then on March 20th, we have Activate the Public Toolkit webinar. Recently, we did our Activate Local webinar, and then you can watch that also on YouTube, and we can probably send that back out when we do our follow-up email. And then Thursday, April 3rd, we have our Get Ready to Advocate virtually rally. So please be sure to join us with some of these upcoming webinars as we plan and prepare for Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month 2025. Let's make it loud. Let's make some noise this year for 2025 for the arts. We need to do that, as we started off at the beginning of this webinar talking about. This is not a time to be silent, but a time to make some noise and to celebrate the arts. And I'm going to pass it to Tracy next to finish us off. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And if you'd like to have a little bit more of a chat, we're happy to stay on. We wanted to book this for an hour so folks could drop in on lunch, but it didn't leave a lot of room for discussion. So if we want to keep the conversation going in the chat, happy to stay on, and happy to wish you a great rest of your day and in leading into the weekend as well. And we do hope you'll find the opportunity to participate. In particular, I just wanted to illuminate a little bit more about the Activate State Lawmakers. That is, this is a toolkit designed for folks that would like to lead advocacy meetings. We provide all the resources, and that's either at our Advocacy Day at the Capitol on April 23rd, or if you want to do DIY lead legislator meetings in your community, either via Zoom or at the district office. And it's kind of all the resources you need, and lots of drop-in office hours and support systems, et cetera. And if you're at all curious about that, please email me or download the toolkit or attend the webinar when the toolkit's ready, and I can tell you more about that. And thank you, everybody, for those that shared in the chat.
Yeah, I think we answered most of the Q&A questions. But again,
hey, Natasha, I just wanted to lift up arts and health. We've actually spent a lot of effort on arts and health that Dennis Paul mentioned in the chat. We did a series of 4 webinars. It was not specified in our policy recommendations, but it is an area we're really deep leaning into. And in April, part of why Health, Healing, and Hope is our focus, you'll see us actually release an arts and health guide, which dives a lot into the concept around social prescribing of arts and culture, and we 100% agree with that. So thank you for mentioning it in the chat, and I hope you'll get a chance, if somebody can throw in the YouTube link that we have. We have an incredible series of 4 webinars that we produced with support from the Music Man Foundation around the intersection of arts and health. And we agree with you, big opportunities there.
thank you, Julie. Definitely very, very important. And I'm looking forward to sharing that guide that our consultant Jennifer Quill worked on.
Hi, Sarah. I see your hand is raised. We're in a webinar format, so you might not be able to vocally share if you want to type a comment.
I just allowed to talk, so
Oh, cool.
Sarah, you can hop in and ask your question if you like.
Should we close the deck?
Sure. Yes.
I think they'll need to unmute.
Yeah, make sure you unmute. Not hearing anything.
Hi, Sarah.
All right, maybe we'll see if Sarah can hop in.
It seems like she might be the only one left in the Zoom.
No, there's 26.
Is there? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not seeing everybody. Thank you.
So Sarah, maybe you can put your questions or comments into the chat. It doesn't look like it's working for you to speak at this point. That would be great. Otherwise, thanks everyone.
And Mary, we are recording this webinar. Again, this will be sent out to each of you with a follow-up email.
Oh,
Wi-Fi. All right. Well, I think, Tracy, we're good. It looks like most of the questions have been asked.
yeah. Oh, Sarah raised her hand again. Is your internet okay? I see your message, Sarah.
Let's see if I can try to allow to talk again.
Hmm.
All right. No luck. Sorry, Sarah. If you
Sorry, Sarah.
feel free to email us if you have a question that you really would like answered. Otherwise, I think we're good, Tracy. We can go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, thank you to our team, Jenica, Jean, LT, work in the background. Really appreciate each of you. Thank you to our readers, Jean, David, Matt, Ted, and thank you, Julie, for your leadership, and Tracy for your leadership with this field engagement survey. This was an excellent project.